It's a very nice moment when a lot of people share different ideas. I'm here today with my colleague, Harry Halpin. He's a professor of mathematics and cryptography and used to work for the W3C. We're also working together in our organization that we'll be talking about today. Before I start the presentation, he's going to give a few words as well to the audience.
Yeah, so Amir is perhaps most interesting, I think, not because of Bitcoin. So it is true that Bitcoin and the blockchain technologies have been massively successful. However, the larger free software movement, the larger movement to create crypto-anarchy, and the anarchist movement in particular are to some extent failures. As nation states collapse, the only thing that seems that has been successful so far is Bitcoin. But for myself, that's not enough. I was wondering for many years how we could recreate a whole new decentralized society. And all of the work that I've been doing for years with crypto, with anarchists, we all know things are about to explode, but nobody knows what to do. So I've been personally incredibly inspired by the events going on in Rojava in Syria, where it's not just about transforming the financial system, but transforming an entire society and then an entire world. But what's been missing is no one from our social circles, no one I knew had actually been there. Actually experienced not just a technical revolution, but an entire social revolution that touched every aspect of life. And more importantly, no one had to come back with a strategy. Instead, just photos of dying people or warfare. But what's needed is a strategy that can be implemented today that stretches from free software into larger society and to the entire world. And I'm very proud to say that I believe Amir has done a remarkable philosophical and political synthesis, going back to the foundations of the history of computing to today. And I believe it's the one way forward that we have to restart our movement to change the fucking world. So, Amir.
Okay. Thank you for the big words. I didn't expect such big words. Thank you for having me here. I believe that ideas play an important role in shaping human history. And what I want to talk about is how technology has been shaped by key ideas. In particular, how certain mechanical ideas of human society got mixed up with politics and technology. What I want to talk about is the story of the free technology movement. It was a movement that showed great potential promise to liberate humanity. At the heart of it was the idea that technology offered a new way to construct a radically different kind of society that never was before possible in history. This movement was influenced by the visions of early scientists who believed in the power of computer technology, not just to serve large industry and military, but for everybody in society to have access to this new power. Influenced by the 60s counterculture, this movement went on to develop the first personal computers. But that's not the end of the story, because this radical vision mutated into the idea of self-regulating systems, which sees human beings as objects managed by computer algorithms. In this vision, the value of human ideas to transform the world was diminished into seeing humans as objects managed by self-regulating systems that keep everybody happy. We now find ourselves in a strange, static dream world, while dark forces are threatening to penetrate our reality. And all the dreams of the techno-utopists have played a role in creating this fake virtual world in which human beings driven by desire, devoid of all sense of higher purpose, become slaves to algorithms and vast computer intelligences. What is interesting about this story is that we now find ourselves at the end point of a movement that originally showed great promise and potential to transform the world, but where faced with the complexity of trying to understand the world, instead chose to withdraw from it, with no idea about where to go next. Facing our growing irrelevance as hackers, our group is here to revitalize the free technology movement and put forward our vision to restore back the potential of technology to transform human society. We will train the next generation of revolutionary hackers, hackers dedicated to using technology to shape future society. Throughout this speech, I will reference a place called Rojava. It is an autonomous region in North Syria following the anarchist philosophy called democratic confederalism. The population of Rojava is roughly 5 million people. It is the most important global development since the collapse of the Twin Towers. At the heart of this story lies a conflict between two men in 1968. One of them is called B.F. Skinner. The other is Lewis Mumford. It was a moment when two ideas about how technology could be used to advance human society first started to take hold. But to understand this conflict, we first need to go back to the development of the computer in the 1800s to the age of industrialism and science, where two people called Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace first began to put together the ideas that today underline modern computers. Charles Babbage was an engineer who wanted to solve industrial problems. He first developed a mechanical calculating device that could be adapted to solve a wide variety of common problems in industry. As he was working, improving his designs, he started to generalize his ideas into creating a new device called the analytical engine. The analytical engine would be a calculating device able to solve all possible mathematical problems. In essence, a computer. His main collaborator, Ada Lovelace, was the daughter of the poet Lord Byron, who died fighting in the Greek War of Independence against the Ottomans. Her mother, incensed and bitter towards her poet father, forbid her daughter from studying the arts. Instead, she pushed her into studying mathematics, logic, and rational sciences. Ada was passionately interested in a wide variety of science, mathematics, and technological fields, particularly with a social motive. She believed that mathematics was fundamentally a creative field, and that intuition and imagination were critical for studying mathematics and science. She named her creative approach poetical science. Babbage, on the other hand, was deeply inspired by the industrial factories of the time. He was a devout Protestant, contributing ideas to economics for increasing factory efficiency, whereas Ada was fascinated by metaphysical questions, comprehending the world, and shaping social reality. What in particular fascinated Ada was the social potentiality of Babbage's computer. Whereas everybody only saw a device as a way to compute better sums for industrial production, Ada saw much more potential across many domains of social life. She made a huge conceptual leap. She realized that the numbers inside this computer could represent symbols, such as letters, musical notes, or graphics, and that the computer could manipulate these symbols according to rules. Ada wrote the world's first computer program, and her mindset led her to ask questions about the analytical engine, examining the role individuals and society play in relation to technology. Unfortunately, Babbage constantly argued with the engineers because he kept changing the design, and his computer never got built. It would take 100 years for the first computers to emerge during World War II, and 150 years before Ada's idealistic vision of a computer in every home became a social reality. During World War II, computers started to emerge. These were giant machines occupying entire rooms to compute trajectories for ballistic missiles and crack German war codes. They were huge, expensive, centralized machines managed by teams of staff. Their sole application was military efficiency, and the early computers reflected that in their design. Even as they were adapted by industry, they remained highly centralized under bureaucratic control. One of those early scientists working on computers was Donald Mickey, a colleague of Alan Turing, who is known as the father of computer science and artificial intelligence. Donald Mickey worked to construct machines to break German code ciphers during World War II. After the war, Donald Mickey went on to work in the new emerging field of AI, which was showing tremendous potential to reshape human society. At the same time, the field of AI was heavily influenced by Turing's thoughts, Donald Mickey's former colleague. His colleague Alan Turing was socially withdrawn and had tried to make sense of the human mind through mathematics. That led him to search for mechanical models that explained human thought. At the same time, it was the 50s, and throughout America, huge exhibits of utopian cities called Futurama were being displayed. Visionaries like Buckminster Fuller were designing new technological houses, and television was telling us humanity would be settled on the moon by the 90s. It was a time of technological optimism, and AI experienced a boom in advancement. However, during the 60s, development of AI had started to stagnate. Much of the earlier optimism and predictions about AI development had turned out to be false. In increasing amounts, the old mathematical approach started to show severe problems. Donald Mickey was originally a trained biologist before dedicating himself to computers. And he pioneered a new approach to AI, which combined the dominant ideas of symbolic logic based on replicating the human mind through reason and theory, and new emerging ideas about the human mind based on interpretive, experimental science in cognitive psychology. Donald Mickey's main aim was to combine these approaches because he saw the pure focus on logic as the main reason for the stagnation of AI development. But Donald Mickey went even further, because what he also did was to state that although we could use AI to solve some very difficult problems, we must also understand why the AI is acting in a certain way. He termed this super articulacy and emphasized that AI didn't need to just solve problems, but also explain how and why they solve problems, and that intelligence must give meaning to their action. In a prophetic speech by Donald Mickey, he also said that the new power of the computer had both the potential to bring untold amounts of human suffering, or the greatest revolution mankind has ever seen. And he goes on to explain that it depends on how we, humans, decide to harness that power. This brings us in the story to the clash between B.F. Skinner and Lewis Mumford in 1968, between the behavioral psychologists who believed in using science to manage society and the utopian idealists who wanted to liberate humanity from power. Around this time in the 60s, there was a BBC documentary called Towards Tomorrow, which presented possible future visions of society. One of these was B.F. Skinner's vision. He asked the question that with the decline of the old forms of authority, how could we organize the masses in a future society? His vision was of a world managed by an elite group of specialized technocrats, where the humans are passive and are constantly monitored so they can be managed to keep them happy. Skinner proposed a new way of control to order people. He argued that in this age of individualism and mass democracy, old forms of coercion are no longer possible. Instead, he proposed a system based off of reward. The documentary first shows us an experiment. Pigeons are trained to peck the correct symbols on buttons in return for a pellet of food. In essence, they behave like mechanical objects to gain the reward. And he took this further in a demonstration on human subjects. In a mental hospital in San Bernardino, California, patients were given a reward for the correct social behavior. If they obeyed the authority and followed the rules, they would get given a paper currency. And at lunchtime, if they had this paper money, they could sit at a nice table with nice cutlery and less people. And if not, then they would have to eat in less elegant conditions. What Skinner created in the hospital was a new ordered hierarchy from a system of reward, one in which the humans don't feel controlled, but feel empowered. Skinner says he sees this as the future of humanity. What is fascinating about this is it is eerily similar to what we see today, where there is a technocratic elite with no interest in politics, simply managing us to keep us happy and make themselves rich. And a lot of this was funded in the 80s with the fake consumer credit boom to reward us, like in the hospital, as a form of social management. Lewis Mumford puts forward an alternative vision. In this video, he first criticizes Skinner and then puts forward an alternative vision where we are all active participants in a society deciding our destiny.
Skinner has a very ingenious way of making a system of highly compulsive organizations seem as though it were a very humane one. This is his great and original contribution. The old-fashioned mechanical collectives, the mega machines, as I call them, were brutal. They used punishment as a way of enforcing conformity. Skinner and the psychological school that he represents have found a much better system than punishment. They first tried it out on animals, and now they're applying it to human beings. Reward them. Make them do exactly what you want them to do without the whip, but with some form of sugar-coated drug or candy, which will make them think that they're actually enjoying every moment of it. This is the most dangerous of all systems of compulsion. That's why I regard Skinner's Walden 2 as another name for hell. And it would be a worse hell because we wouldn't realize we were there. We would imagine that we're still in heaven. Most of the reactions that have taken place in art, including those that come under the head of the beatniks and the hippies, have some underlying sense in the reaction itself. But the remedy is part of the disease. The remedy, in fact, makes it easier for the institutions that now have their hold upon us to be even more compulsive and even more effective than ever before. If we don't care, if we drop out, if we lose ourselves in insane fantasy of some kind, whether a natural fantasy of the neurotic or the chemically induced fantasy of someone who takes drugs, we lose our possibility of restoring our own autonomy, of taking charge of our life, because this requires greater energy, greater effort than that which is required to live through the daily life of a machine worker. We have to become fully activated human beings, every part of us, tremendously alive and ready to take charge. And this can't be done by people who are in escape, people who form the habit of total rejection. We must know what we want, not just what we don't want.
Mumford was a philosopher of technology and a utopian idealist who believed that science and technology did not develop in a straight path, but were influenced heavily by ideas and culture. He wrote books comparing symbolism in modern technological inventions with ancient monuments to examine how these ideas from the ancient world were tightly woven into the DNA of modern science and technology. Mumford proposed that we had to use technology to develop a new free society, which restored back the autonomy to human beings lost by what he termed the mega machine. He called for a study to study of technology to free humanity and create an organic modernity, which he termed polytechnics. At the same time, during the 60s, the hacker movement was being birthed. Computers were still large, centralized machines controlled by a bureaucracy, but they had begun to move away from the military and into the hands of industry. In this environment emerged small groups of people who believed that this new power had the potential to advance humanity, and they became obsessed with gaining the fruit of this knowledge. Many of them got low-level jobs near computers as technicians, or even janitors, where they were able to gain access to these instruments of power and become familiar with their inner workings. They would wait for missed or late appointments for people to use these computers, and they would jump on the machines to gain access to them in those spare moments. This community wrote its own software and shared the code and knowledge with each other in person. Slowly, in their garages, homes, and universities, they began to develop their own computer hardware, which led to the development of the first personal computers. This was a collaborative, idealistic community that really believed they could use computer technology to change the world and improve humanity. They are the reason why today we have computers, laptops, and telephones. As the potential of the new computers became apparent, investment companies saw an opportunity, and huge amounts of capital started to flow into this previously marginalized community of hackers. As new business ventures were formed, the culture of this community completely transformed. Whereas before, values of collaboration, knowledge sharing, and idealism were central, the new companies instead sought efficiency, profit, and growth. This was an important step for developing the personal computer into a usable product. But in the process, something very important was being lost. Before, hackers would share code and work to empower humanity, whereas the new technology companies started to close technology off into their own personal silos, restricting access to the code and refusing to share knowledge with other groups. In their rush towards money, the hackers lost sight of what gave them strength as a community. But not all the hackers went along with the changes. One young hacker called Richard Stallman resented what he saw happening to the hacker community. Here, in this video, he explains his background and philosophy.
My project is to make all software free. Computers are sort of a fascinating build-it set where you can build things that you can then use to build more things.
What you're building is kind of alive. It has a life of its own. It's a little thing that follows all your commands.
It allows you to put together structures that you couldn't have put together before and carry this on until you're making structures thousands of times as big. I'd get up around 5 or so and come into the lab, read the messages people would send me. Then I'd go out to Chinatown with people and have a nice dinner. Then I'd come back and I would write programs all night, and around 7 in the morning I'd go to sleep.
Richard Stallman has been called the last pure hacker for choosing to remain at MIT despite the temptations of the commercial world, true to the spirit of the early hackers.
What they had in common was mainly love of excellence in programming. They wanted to make their programs that they used be as good as they could. They also wanted to make them do neat things. They wanted to be able to do something in a more exciting way than anyone believed possible and show, look how wonderful this is. I bet you didn't believe this could be done.
Philosophical phone freaks and early hackers believe that information and tools should be free, or at least available to serious seekers, and they openly shared their work with others. Some argue that the computer revolution could not have happened without that hacker ethic. Today, hackers are divided between the old values and the new. They can't agree whether source codes, the basic blueprints of a program, should be shared or not.
Hackers frequently want to look at code, like operating system listings and the like, to learn how it was done before them, because this is how they're going to learn to do it. And source should be made available reasonably to those sort of people, not to copy, not to sell, but to learn from.
Tools I will give away to anybody, but the product, that's my soul is in that product. I don't want anyone fooling with that. I don't want anyone hacking into that product and changing it, because then it won't be mine.
Imagine if you bought a house and the basement was locked and only the original building contractor had the key. If you needed to make any change, repair anything, you had to go to him. And if he was too busy doing something else, he'd tell you to get lost and you'd be stuck.
It's like somebody saying, looking at a painting and saying, well, I don't like that color over there, so I'll just take a can of paint and change it. That wrecks the whole painting. Okay, that changes everything that I did. And that to me is one of the greatest insults.
You're at that person's mercy, and you become downtrodden and resigned. That's what happens when the blueprints to a computer program are kept secret by the organization that sells it. And that's the usual way things are done.
Stallman set an ambitious aim for the hackers: to create a new free operating system, not owned by any company or organization, instead freely available to everybody. Nobody took him seriously. Besides being massively complex, it didn't seem to make sense. Why would anybody spend years to develop an operating system which wasn't sold for profit? It seemed to raise more problems than it solved, and so he was ignored. But Stallman was very persistent in everything he did. He never took no for an answer, and if he believed in something, he would dedicate himself to it. For the next decade, he went and wrote his own operating system. It took a lot of energy, but slowly he gained a small following, which gradually grew larger over time, step by step. And the result of that is the birth of the Linux operating system in the early 90s, which is arguably one of the most important events in the history of computing. The start of the 90s saw another burst of energy among hackers. The free software movement was expanding. Crypto-anarchists were developing new ideas about money and engaging in conflicts with power and the state. This was also the age of the hack lab, when hackers were setting up underground hack labs to experiment with free technology. The community created their own technologies and communicated through decentralized, uncensored networks like the chat protocol IRC. This communication system had different networks people could enter with an online identity and discuss topics in different chat rooms. When the Soviet Union fell, all communications such as television, radio, and the telephone stopped. But through IRC, hackers inside Moscow were able to communicate events to the rest of the world. Meanwhile, the ideas of Lewis Mumford had started to grow into their own bodies of ideas. One of the people influenced by these new ideas was the leader of a guerrilla organization fighting the Turkish state called Abdullah Öcalan. His group, the PKK, had started an armed campaign in 1984 for Kurdish rights as a nationalistic communist group. But as he and others in the organization started to see the horror that was unleashed as tens of thousands of people were killed on both sides, there began a movement towards demands for cultural rights and democratization of the centralized Turkish state. In 1999, Öcalan was captured and imprisoned as a sole prisoner on an island in Turkey, guarded by over 1,000 soldiers, where he remains to this day. While there, he began to study many authors and pieced together a new theory of anarchism called democratic confederalism. One of these authors that heavily influenced Öcalan was Moray Bookchin, who based his ideas off Lewis Mumford and his writings on technology. Bookchin had been rejected by the anarchists in the 90s for criticizing them, because he accused the anarchist movement of becoming a lifestyle rather than a serious revolutionary movement. Here is Bookchin talking about why communism failed.
I literally saw this movement disappear, and disappear from history, at least as far as the United States is concerned. And I have no belief whatever that it will come back again. Namely, what I'm saying is, I saw the end of the classical workers' movement. And I had to ask myself, Why had this come about? What did this mean? And the conclusion I came to is this, that the workers' movement never really had a revolutionary potential. That the factories, and I had worked in factories for 10 years, and had worked in factories partly as a labor organizer in the old CIO before it united with the AFFL, when it was still in a very militant, stage of its development. That this workers' movement had never really had the revolutionary potentialities that Marx attributed to it. That in point of fact, the factory, which is supposed to organize the workers in Marx's language, mobilize them and instill in them the class consciousness that is to stem out of a conflict between wage labor and capital, in fact had created habits of mind in the worker that served to regiment the worker, that served in fact to assimilate the worker to the work ethic, to the industrial routine, to hierarchical forms of organization, and that no matter how compellingly Marx had argued that such a movement could have revolutionary consequences, in fact, such a movement could have nothing but a purely adaptive function, an adjunct to the capitalist system itself. And I began to try to explore what were movements and ideologies, if you like, that really were liberatory, that really freed people of this hierarchical sensibility and mentality, of this authoritarian outlook, of this complete assimilation by the work ethic. And I now began to turn very consciously toward anarchist views. Because anarchism posed the question not simply of a struggle between classes based upon economic exploitation. Anarchism really was posing a much broader historical question that even goes beyond our industrial civilization. Not just classes, but hierarchy. Hierarchy as it exists in the family. Hierarchy as it exists in the school. Hierarchy as it exists in sexual relationships. Hierarchy as it exists between ethnic groups.
Öcalan advanced his ideology of democratic confederalism, which is a big step forwards for the anarchist movement. He is a great thinker, and his writings are the most important of this century. Meanwhile, during the late 90s, the web took off and first started to become popular. Companies saw another opportunity. After the early personal computer boom, everybody was determined this time around not to miss out on the opportunity to become rich. But there was very little understanding about what the web actually was, or even how companies could make money from it. And the dot-com boom became the dot-com bubble as business venture after business venture went bankrupt. At the same time, Stallman's movement had grown, but Stallman had failed to turn it into an organized and funded movement. While his ideas inspired many to devote themselves to the cause, there was no organized structure to facilitate the growing movement. A new group of people emerged that attempted a coup on Stallman's free software movement. Keen to attract business interests and present themselves as the clean face of the hacker movement, they started a rigorous branding campaign, renaming free software to open source. They made dubious claims that open source code had actual business benefits, such as being better quality and cheaper, that it wasn't a question of ethics and values, but a simple business equation. One of the main thinkers and initiators of open source was Eric Raymond. Unlike Stallman's hippie politics and talk of sharing, Raymond believed in American values and individualism. His main work was a book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which presented the open source software development as an open marketplace with many spontaneous actors all acting in their self-interest. He coined the term scratching a personal itch to explain that programmers worked on open source not because they wanted to solve a personal problem they experienced. Raymond is also well known for the phrase, "Given enough eyes, all bugs are shallow." The argument basically goes like this. When you have thousands of people participating in software projects, all contributing a small amount of time, then it becomes inevitable that bugs will be discovered and fixed. The older idea of groups of hackers united by an idea, developing technology to challenge power and spread their values, was replaced by a new idea of spontaneous individuals all working in their own self-interest to write open source software. It was the idea that we could create decentralized networks of rational, self-motivated individuals, free from any constraints of power outside of politics. What ended up happening is that the hacker movement submitted to the same power complex of the system it originally aimed to fight against, and it lost the power it once had to use technology to shape the world. Post-2000, with the collapse of the Twin Towers, resource conflicts, and Islamic terrorism, the technology world, rather than directly confronting politics and power, instead preferred to withdraw into constructing dream worlds. The technology world became driven by the idea of individuals spontaneously pursuing their own personal interests, rather than groups of people driven through a shared vision and a sense of ambition. And what happened is that we allowed our legacy to be absorbed by the state and into serving power. In this new world we created, anybody could be whoever they wanted to be, free from power. But in actual fact, what we had created was an illusion that allowed power to cloak itself with technology, making reality less tangible for people to grasp. It had first begun in the 90s with a lawyer named Peter Thiel. He had lost money when the dot-com bubble burst and was determined for it not to happen again. Peter Thiel started to build a software company to build a cryptographic payment system called Confinity. It was influenced by earlier ideas that had existed on the internet, originally developed by the crypto-anarchists, and it made Thiel into a billionaire. This product would later be renamed PayPal. However, Thiel became a heroic figure in Silicon Valley, and he liked to present himself as a libertarian hero from an Ayn Rand novel. He funded seasteading institutes and libertarian think tanks with his wealth. He became a sought-out thinker by heads of industry and won multiple awards. However, beneath Thiel's veneer is a deep cynicism and distrust of ethics. In 2015, a document released to TechCrunch revealed that one of Thiel's lesser-known companies, called Palantir, was providing advanced analysis and networking infrastructure for US intelligence services. As TechCrunch explained, the US spy agencies also employed Palantir to connect databases across departments. Before this, most of the databases used by the CIA and FBI were siloed, forcing users to search each database individually. Now everything is linked together using Palantir. When Mark Zuckerberg, inspired by IRC and other social networks, started to build Facebook to connect people, Peter Thiel was there from the beginning as the main investor guiding the project. He is also a major partner for the depoliticized hack lab of Silicon Valley called Y Combinator, which funded Coinbase, the signer of the New York Agreement. And he is an early funder of Ethereum. What is important to realize is that technology and how it grows is deeply influenced by the people where that technology originates from and what they believe. During the post-2000 era, there was a wave of optimism, followed by the failed revolutions of the pirates, Occupy Wall Street, and the Arab Spring. It was here that Wikipedia emerged as an ambitious project to compile the sum of all human knowledge. Wikipedia was influenced by the earlier idea from Eric Raymond and the open source movement of large groups of people coming together, all making a small contribution to build large-scale projects. At first, it remained small, but as the project expanded and became known, it grew very quickly. The idea worked. It seemed to validate the earlier open source idea of managing people with decentralized systems. Prophets of the Wikipedia revolution started to write books and organize conferences about the magic of what they called commons-based peer production. But Then something strange happened. Wikipedia released statistics on the project, and when people began to analyze the data, the reality we saw didn't fit our expectations. What we saw is that most of the articles are written by a small group of editors that spend hours every day working on Wikipedia. What this showed us is that it wasn't that Wikipedia was written by large groups of people, each contributing a sentence or two spontaneously. What we actually saw is that Wikipedia was written by a small core of dedicated people who spent the vast majority of their time working on Wikipedia, and that what brings these people together is an idea that drives them towards a vision. We see the same thing in open source projects. There is always a core of developers driven by the project's vision. No project was ever, in my personal experience, driven by a diffuse mass of developers working for their own self-benefit. The mantra, "many eyes make all bugs shallow," is false. Software is a complex work that requires a huge level of coordination, hard work, and creative thinking based off of real understanding and knowledge. Developers do not spend years of their life to write software to solve a specific personal itch or problem that occupies themselves. They are driven through ambition, the ability to influence the world, to craft something meaningful, and the satisfaction of good work. Many of our original ideas were full of huge potential, but they have been absorbed by power into serving its own interests. Why has this happened? What is important to know is that what drove these projects was not a new technique or feature. It was groups of people driven by a vision, exploring new ideas and possibilities to try and realize it. Bitcoin itself has a long history going back to the roots of the crypto-anarchist movement as a political invention. So it is clear that our movement needs new ideas that can bring people together towards a vision. But we must not limit ourselves to technology and become fixated on creating products to fill the spaces in the environment around us. We must think on a big scale, think globally, making an effort to understand the political context of the here and the now, and how we apply technology to influence the world around us. Our organization is a group of revolutionary hackers focused on the global struggle for revolution for a libertarian society, what we call the democratic nation. We are a part of the emerging democratic confederalist movement. This Western system of managed stability has turned into lurching from crisis to crisis without any vision of where we're heading as a civilization. This Western liberal system has exhausted itself of the ability to advance humanity forwards. Breaking out of this cage, idealistic movements are forming, such as the New Right and ISIS, in the gaps among this global breakup of power. Western society has grown comfortable, emphasizing the sensory world of comfort, pleasure, and fame, with very little creative thought to the ideas that drive society and culture. We are erased from our roots, constantly breaking with the past to impose a new, superior model in a thirstless drive for efficiency. We are disconnected from space and time, with a politics based off of abstract models that disregard geography and history. Art relies more and more on a frenzied emphasis of the new and the shocking, on sensationalism, while religion, stripped of its substance, is tending towards fundamentalism. Everything is constantly changing, while economics and politics has become blindly hedonistic and utilitarian, enslaving humans inside a hierarchical, mechanistic state system. The system has exhausted itself. It is the final days of Rome. So what is happening in Rojava is the source of an ideological movement advancing the legacy of anarchism. Rojava will be one source of change throughout the world, one of many. For instance, in Catalonia, Barcelona in Comú is a municipalist movement based off the ideas of Bookchin and Rojava, and they now occupy the position of the mayor in Barcelona. And Latin American anarchist and Marxist groups, which are really well organized throughout the continent, and they have begun to now form groups and organizations to study and follow this ideology. We are at the start of another era in global history. Groups taking root now, in the future, will be vying for power among the dissipation of the liberal world order. Democratic confederalists are one of these movements. It's our work now to lay down the foundation so our later struggles will be a success. The technology world is too focused on capital and products. What we actually need are ideological hackers. Trained revolutionary hackers to serve as the forefront of this change, as the prophets, carrying the message, able to comprehend our world and organize larger groups of people towards a shared vision. To this end, we are establishing a training academy in Barcelona to train a core group of politicized revolutionary hackers that will be responsible for organizing a new network of technologists. We are in a stage now of forming important key concepts that would lead and advance the hacker movement forwards. In particular, we seek to make a synthesis between the ideas of the crypto-anarchists, free software movement, hackers, pirates, and other great thinkers into an area of study for how we apply these techniques towards our goal of democratic confederalism. We are reviving the field of study first proposed by the great thinker Lewis Mumford, who named this POLYTECHNICS. Okay, that doesn't work. Technics is concerned with coming into being. That is, thinking and acting how something may come into being, which can either exist or not exist, and whose origin is in the creator, not simply in the product itself. Polytechnics is about applying our knowledge of techniques for the construction of a democratic modernity, a free, autonomous humanity, and restoring back the organic synthesis of nature with civilization. We instrumentalize techniques to further our goals. And for us to be successful, we must have a full comprehension of the true meaning of freedom, hierarchy, and state. Our starting point is the revolution in Rojava, which we see as a stepping stone to further opportunities internationally. We want to advance concepts such as cryptographic law, decentralized governance, libertarian economics, and free technology inside the Rojava movement. This is an ideological movement that is setting down roots internationally and will continue to spread. We take our place as hackers to build the technical arm of this revolutionary movement. We are not just hackers, but missionaries of an idea, training more hackers to replace us and grow as a movement. The first phase in our long-term strategic plan is to work on free software, telecommunications networks, and Bitcoin projects. When Ethereum was first released, one of its main projects was literally advertised as unstoppable code and quickly raised $150 million, becoming the highest ever crowdfunded project in the history of the internet. But that's not the end of the story, because it was hacked and lost over $50 million. Ethereum itself had to change its unmutable code to reverse this human error. What we should have realized then is we aren't just working with technology, but with people and the ideas that shape them. Bitcoin now suffers from a crisis of confidence after a series of open confrontations. The task now is to understand the underlying cause of this division. It's because of the underlying ideology of the people involved in the project. The way forwards for resolving this series of conflicts is not a new form of management or a bureaucratic process inside of Bitcoin, but a real synthesis and restoration of values back to the project. The developers of Bitcoin should be trained ideologically so that the project gains coherency towards a shared vision. Any structure we make is only as good as the ethical values of the people inside it. The main role of technology is not shaping the external world to coerce people to act in a certain way, but to support an ideology that can change the internal world of people's thoughts. Richard Stallman did more than write an alternative operating system that replaced the proprietary operating systems. He gave us a vision and a long-term goal to work towards. He wrote articles and made speeches which inspired thousands of hackers to join his cause. Stallman inspired me through his ideas and action. Stallman is a prophet who spoke about power and technology decades ago, predicting that our current path would lead to vast corporate and state intelligence apparatuses that wield huge amounts of power over technology users. What Stallman proposed was taking back control of technology through a movement that sought to technologically empower its users. So we're here to find allies and fellow travelers who are in this cause with us, to find the people who would join our organization or give us funding or offer us places to work. Never before in modernity have we had an opportunity like this to break free. We are entering a tipping point where history is bifurcating after a long period of stability. We are moving into a global breakup of power, rapid multiplication of ideologies, and a shift in the global geopolitical balance that is opening up gaps in the governance around the world. Humanity is facing a future with a huge amount of suffering and conflict. There is no happy, free love future awaiting us, but a dark period, followed of hardship, followed by regeneration. However, it is also an opportunity for revolutionaries that are well prepared to take advantage of this coming crisis and steer it towards their vision. And not everybody can be revolutionary. It takes commitment, sacrifice, discipline, and dedicating yourself to a cause beyond yourself. To be the points of change able to fight, we must achieve self-mastery and reach our full potential as human beings. Very few people have that courage and ability to give up everything and pursue history. But those that come with us now, in these early days, will reach their destiny. Every human being has a divine purpose, but you choose whether to walk this path or not. Whether you strive to reach your goal and grab it, or to remain down on earth, chasing the things that distract you from your path. Hackers have withdrawn into a bubble and separated themselves from the real problems of this world. We are playing a game with the system. Just look at some of the topics in this conference. They are more about comfort and self-indulgence rather than changing the world and influencing global politics. Hackers used to shape the world. We were powerful. We were a force that exerted our will on the world. Now, we have withdrawn into making toys and trinkets to amuse ourselves. What happened to that will and ambition for greatness? And it's worse than that, because our dreams have mutated into nightmares. And unless this movement has a big change, all of the efforts of our forefathers, of the crypto-anarchists, the free software movement, and the hackers will amount to nothing. Everything will fail and dissipate, because the world now is in the midst of a huge global shift, and we are not engaged with this change. We have become depoliticized vessels of emptiness, dazzled by the lights of modernity. This year, the UK had a general election to choose the next leader of the country. One of the parties was the Pirate Party, while the other parties talked about terrorism and immigration, the two most important issues facing European society. The Pirate Party talked about copyright reform and libel law. Are we going to confine ourselves to irrelevance, or are we going to apply our knowledge towards something useful? We live in a technological society, and technology is another front in the struggle for freedom. We are facing a deep social crisis in the West that is not simply economic. No new economic or political model will save us. Neither will some new innovation or technology. The huge level of mental disorders are a symptom of the destruction of humanity that we feel a part of us has died subjugated to this mechanistic industrial system of enslavement that started with building pyramids and has ended with nuclear weapons. But there are signs that the system has exhausted its capacity to manage the crisis any longer. New movements are rising up to exploit the vacuum, and we will all be forced to pick sides. The baby boomers remained neutral, and they became victims of power and domination. Technology is an instrument that hackers wield, but we need a vision that gives us meaning and direction. Our group is the most exciting technology project in the world right now, at the forefront of history. Whoever decides to walk with us now will become a leader. No, you guys do it over there. This way. Oh, no, other way. Freedom, technics, anarchy. Freedom, technics, anarchy. Freedom, technics, anarchy. Freedom, technics, anarchy.
So thank you a lot, Amir, for your interesting and comprehensive presentation. I think we have still some time for questions. So please ask. Okay.
All right, we'll do this after.
Amir, what about Dark Wallet, man? We funded this project.
So, you know, I was talking with Peter Todd, and he said to me that all of the anonymity technologies in Dark Wallet have been superseded by new technologies inside Bitcoin. So he says it's not worth it for me to work on Dark Wallet because something better is going to come very soon. But yeah, it's still something we're thinking about because we need a lot of Bitcoin infrastructure that we need to build. We will be building a lot of Bitcoin projects and anonymity technologies.
Okay, question 2.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that great presentation. It really captured a lot of different aspects of today's society going through history till now. You referenced how due to capital moving into the space, so this was in reference to the early computer days, so people taking the past, making a personal computer. People lost track and there was a cultural shift, no longer sharing, collaborating, thinking as a collective, but rather thinking exclusive groups and closing the doors which allowed them to have the power in the first place. And I have a quote which I really think resonates with this, and I'll get to my question, I apologize. When a nation goes down or a society perishes, one condition must always be found. They forget where they came from. They lost sight of what had brought them along, and that's by Carl Sandburg. So to reference this, I want to bring it back to what's happening right now with cryptocurrency. I see the same trend occurring, where the starting point or the phase 3 or 4 years ago for me at a lot of these conferences was a crypto-anarchist movement, or perhaps in many ways opposing the traditional banking systems. And I'm seeing as more money is coming into this, people are losing track of what started this. And this really annoys me when I go into conferences or general discussions where the topic has shifted from the political movement, as you said, it was the birth of a political ideology, into this piece of technology on how people can profit from. What advice, you covered so many different aspects of historical movements, whether it was the computer movement, the free software movement, the internet, and now onto cryptocurrencies. How can we escape that same kind of force of ideology onto people where they forget where it came from? And like Linux itself has been taken and put into so many applications we don't even realize. How do we not lose control of that? How do we not lose sight of the importance of the message, and that's something that really troubles and puzzles me at the same time.
What really drives projects forward or advances humanity in general is idealism. Like all throughout history, many scientists dedicate their lives to discovery and they gain no reward from that. But the point about Richard Stallman is that he started an idealistic movement that gained momentum, but he failed to turn that into something more organized, to get funding, to start to establish places where people work on projects. So for instance, when I was 16 or 18, I was completely absorbed by free software. I thought it was one of the most important things in the development of modern history. But it was a very difficult situation to work on open source as a young programmer with no support. If there were places with a bed, with food, I would go there and I would work every single day and devote myself to free software. That's a really important part of a successful movement, is to have the resources, to have that material capital. So a lot of the idealists a lot of these idealistic movements cut themselves off from that, cut themselves off from organization, from trying to think about structure and to institutionalize a movement. And what they ended up happening is other groups came along and ended up taking over from them, which is what happened with the open source movement. However, these movements, when they come and they're just purely concerned with profit, with extracting wealth from the real value that's created underlying by the technology, by the innovation, what happens is that the movement loses its original goals, its original meaning, and ends up to dissipate, which is now something that we see happening in Bitcoin, for instance. So the important task of Bitcoin is to restore back values as the center of project. Not saying, oh yeah, we need to reject capital, we need to reject material resource. After all, Bitcoin is a project to make money, but we do need to think about that at the core of the project, we have our ideals. And that the aim of Bitcoin as a project is to challenge the power of the central banks. That is the biggest tool we have ever since the development of the central banks to challenge their power. That's a really important piece of technology. If we don't apply it in that way, if we go, oh, yeah, it's for cheaper transactions or for making smart contracts between my friends, without losing the focus, what is the actual core aim of this project? Then what do we end up doing? We end up just developing objects to fill the spaces around us, to make ourselves more comfortable. That's not actually changing the world.
On the ground in Rojava, what kind of work are you doing exactly? Like in Barcelona, what kind of, are you teaching people technical stuff, or is it ideological, or what are you looking for?
Yeah, I need skilled hackers that we train with do skills training on all different topics to create a well-rounded human being that is ready to go wherever is needed to work on all different projects, to be the points that can organize larger networks of people. But that's not something, I think a lot of problems I've seen in, for instance, hacker spaces or anarchist places, people come and go, there's no real commitment, there's no real dedication. So not everybody can do that. Some people have family, some people just don't want to. But we have to be more selective about the people that we build the base of our movements around.
Can I just make one quick comment? And I think one interesting question, which I think is sort of being suggested, is what could the possible possible role of Bitcoin be in these revolutionary situations? So obviously, destroying the power of fiat currency in the central banks is of utmost necessity. Also, in places like Syria and in Europe before World War II, one of the most dangerous things that could happen was massive state-sponsored hyperinflation, right? Before Nazi Germany and now in Syria, there is massive inflation. Imagine what it would be not just to use Bitcoin as some sort of get-rich-quick scheme or some sort of ICO about a fucking Ether token, but imagine what it could be to actually move an entire society into a decentralized, non-inflationary cryptocurrency. That's a project which is, I think, just as ambitious and ultimately just as valuable as many of the other projects here. And I would even say more so. But who's working on it? Very few people.
I've got this one.
You still seem quite hopeful for the future of Bitcoin, and I was wondering, with all your kind of knowledge and expertise in the field, don't you think that maybe it's not Bitcoin that is the currency that takes us all further, especially when we consider how Bitcoin is funded by third-party interests that take it into different political directions? Don't you think it's that we need a blockchain that's independently funded by its own creation of currency, and that is decentrally controlled by the users? And have you looked into other currencies such as Decred that have voting capabilities from the users and independent funding?
I'm not the prophet that's going to come to you and say, yeah, Bitcoin, it's going to explode and it's going to take over the world and it's inevitable change. We just need to wait and twiddle our hands and Bitcoin will take over the universe. It's not a given thing that Bitcoin is going to grow and is going to become preeminent and take over the world. It's something we have to work towards making happening. However, Bitcoin show huge amounts of potential as an instrument that we can use to challenge power. We all know that this financial system of enslavement work through a system of central banks that literally have a number in a computer that people work their whole lives to get some amount of that currency, which is completely abstract. People work every single day in jobs they completely hate to earn currency, which is just a fiction. This is how this system of enslavement, one of the central tools that the state uses for conscripting vast amounts of human labor into a gigantic machine with a military arm, with a extractive resource arm, and a really sinister form of exploitation and power that psychologically degrade the society. So Bitcoin is a really powerful weapon that we can use against that. I'm not saying that there aren't things that can be improved with Bitcoin, things that we can do better, but I really haven't seen any dramatic, vast improvement over Bitcoin. But what Bitcoin does have is a huge community behind it, a huge amount of brain power to solve problems that exist in Bitcoin, a huge amount of capital. So I don't think it's a successful strategy that Bitcoin is just a tiny currency, barely significant in the world, that we're going to split ourselves off into all different projects. Bitcoin, the most important thing now we can do, is to support Bitcoin, to challenge the power of central banks, to create our own decentralized currency. Bitcoin is not the final evolution in our financial development, but it's a step away from the state and ordered hierarchical systems of relations. But there are problems inside Bitcoin as well. Bitcoin is a social system. And we have to recognize that. It's not a perfect, abstract thing that just exists outside of time and space.
Hello. So thank you for your presentation. So you are speaking really a lot about Bitcoin, but you know, if I just remember when I was young, anarchist and all that, you are going to speak with the people, trying to explain them the system, how it is working, the thinkers and all that. But the main issue it is really, and what does bring me to be interested in blockchain, it was really about the decentralized autonomous organization. Because the main idea, if you see the Spanish Revolution, if you see what happens in Ukraine with Magnovista, it was how you are going to organize the groups, how you are going to organize the exchange out of the system. If you are really thinking about building another system, how you are going to give the right of the vote to the people to organize the system. So of course the currency is an issue, but the really thing important is how you involve people in the system, how you make them products in the system, create it, to defend it, and to find the real value in this new system, and to change the exchange, how the exchange is coming. And then after maybe a second point very quickly, a second anarchist critic, if I can say that, there was this very famous Polonese anarchist writer, Majewski, who wrote about the socialism of the intellectual. His critics at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20s, was that Marxism was in fact built by Marx, by other people, and was taken by the aristocracy of the workers. You know, even Marx was speaking about the Lumpen proletariat, that these people are very dangerous, that's not the good one. And when you are speaking about anarchy and about developers, you are not thinking that maybe you are creating this new, higher class in that can make
all right, I know what you're saying, yeah. First of all, you keep talking about rights. Rights is a liberal concept. That is a form of domination exerted over people. You talk about structure. You're thinking about models. You're talking about new political models. You're talking about decentralization. What Bookchin actually was saying in that video is that the reason why Marxism failed is because the factory worker working every day in the factory, doing that mechanical work. Like, what did Marx say? Marx said that every day working in the factory, the worker would see how he's being dominated, how he's being exploited, and that would create in him a new class consciousness that would cause him to rise up and to overthrow the factory industrial-based system and to take control of it. What actually happened, what we saw, is every day in the factory, doing mechanical work, create in the mind of the worker patterns of thought that they internalize this form of domination. So that's what we have to understand, is that if we truly want to break free of this system, it's going to require changing the thoughts of humans, not just some new way of ordering the society, some rearrangement of the structure. No, the structure is the problem. The structure exists because human beings are siloed into different specialities, into different parts in a gigantic machine. You're a doctor, you're a policeman, you're an engineer. If I live in the forest, if I feed myself, if I clothe myself, if I keep myself warm, if I'm taking care of all of my needs as a human being, there is no state involved in that. I'm a free, autonomous human being. But we don't live in the forest. We live in a civilization. I have clothes, I eat well, I sleep in a house, I use technology. Where does all that come from? The phone that we use is created in a factory. The factory is a gigantic machine with different mechanical parts inside. The human beings inside that factory are mechanical objects. They're not thinking human beings driven by ideals, driven by a sense of purpose or destiny. No, they are objects of power, following obedient, following orders, following commands that come from an elite that is pulling different levers and buttons to just maintain stability, not to move as a society towards something with a sense of purpose and meaning, just to maintain it, for it to grow. So we need to get free of this liberal way of thinking. Mm-hmm.
Organize the society, and how you can use some decentralized autonomous organization to organize the way of production, because the way you produce is linked with the way you're thinking. If you are not making people produce freely in a different way of trading, you're not going to make them think differently. It's very easy.
No, but again, you're saying this, you're talking about production and the external world first, as opposed to the thoughts and the subjective. We need to teach people philosophy, mythology, history, sociology. That's where the change comes from.
Yes, but for that they must have free time, and to have free time they don't have to go to work, and to go to work you have to change the system how it works, because if you send the people
we need to get rid of the
working
system.
12 hours a day in a factory,
you don't want to change
they
anything.
are not going to
you want to just
change
rearrange
their way
it a
of
little
thinking,
bit to keep
because
it going
at
on.
the end of the day they're
That's
going to watch
bourgeois
TV
ideology.
and they're going to be lazy.
Okay, thank you a lot. Thank you a lot, Amir.